Chapter 8 is going to be dealing with agency relationships and the duties that real estate licensees have with their customers and clients. To begin with, let me say that prior to 1985, we really didn't have agency laws. When we entered into a contract with a seller, we created a fiduciary relationship and we worked for the seller's best interest. Later, when we decided that we needed some rules and regulations governing the way that we treat people in a real estate transaction, we created the agency laws. One of the first things that was done was the creation of dual agency. Dual agency simply meant that we were able to represent both the buyer and the seller at the same time and dealing with both of them in a fiduciary relationship. Now, a fiduciary relationship means that we're looking out for their best interest over somebody else. Well, obviously, dual agency didn't work. It's hard to represent a buyer working for their best interest and working for the seller and their best interest in the same transaction at the same time. Dual agency has been repealed. And since then, we now have some different agency rules. Probably the most dominating is the transaction brokerage relationship. As far as who a principal is, typically speaking, when we use the word principal, we're talking about the person to whom we have a fiduciary with. And the broker becomes the agent. Now, let me also make this very clear that we understand that although sales associates may be called agents, in a legal sense, you're really a sub-agent of the broker. It's the broker who is the agent. A customer is typically that person that we're working with and not for. Remember that your principal you work for and with their best interest, whereas a customer that you don't. As far as the fiduciary relationships are concerned, I'm going to talk more about those in a second or two, but those are pretty encompassing and pretty strict. As far as disclosure requirements in agency, the state of Florida requires real estate licensees to disclose certain agency relationships when we're dealing in a residential transaction. Now, let me define residential transaction for you. Typically speaking, we're talking about up to 4 units, up to a fourplex, a vacant lot that can be built on up to 4 units, or some type of agricultural properties of 10 acres or less. That's considered to be residential real estate. Anything else, there are no disclosure rules that we have to worry about. As far as the authorized brokerage relationships that we're dealing with today, there are 3. There is the no brokerage relationship, there's a single agent relationship, and there's a transaction brokerage relationship. And I'm going to talk about those in detail. First of all, the no brokerage relationship. This is the one that and some people call this a non-representation, but honestly there is representation. It's been misnamed actually. In the no brokerage relationship, there's a disclosure form that has to be delivered to a buyer or seller if you're dealing in this manner prior to showing property. And the disclosure is going to describe what our relationship is and what we can or can't do for them. We have to deal openly, honestly, and fairly. We have to disclose all latent material defects that the property might have. We have to place money in escrow according to escrow rules. And we're supposed to present all offers from a practical standpoint. That's the limitations to it. As far as a single agent relationship is concerned, that's the other side of agency. The no brokerage relationship has the least amount of rules and also liability. The single agent relationship has the most. In the single agent relationship, what we're creating is a fiduciary relationship. And in that fiduciary relationship, we have to deal openly and honestly and fairly. The big one, though, is loyalty. That we have to look out for our client's best interest over anybody else, including ourselves. Also, we have confidentiality, where we have to keep confidential anything that we learn about our client. And we have to disclose anything that we learn that could benefit them as well. We have obedience, full disclosure, accounting of funds, and we also have skill, care, and diligence. Skill, care, and diligence has to do with working prudent. In other words, there are certain things that we should know and should keep up with, and if we don't, we could be held for culpable negligence if we don't. And we're also responsible for presenting any and all offers. Now, as far as the single agent disclosure notice, that has to be done either prior to showing property or prior to entering into a contract, whichever comes first. The last type of agency relationship is the transaction brokerage relationship. This is non-fiduciary. We're acting more as a facilitator. In the transaction brokerage relationship, there are no disclosure forms required. However, we still have to deal openly, honestly, and fairly, accounting for all funds. We have to use skill, care, and diligence. We have to disclose all latent and material defects that we might find out about the property. And we have to present all offers. Now, in terms of confidentiality, let me say this. It's limited. We can't say anything about either party that we're working with that could be harmful. That means that we're allowed to work with both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. But just remember that we can't tilt. We can't take sides as a transaction broker. As far as transitioning from a single agent relationship into a transaction brokerage relationship, the state of Florida does allow us to do that. But there's a form that we have to deliver that we're moving from that special fiduciary single agent relationship into that non-fiduciary transaction brokerage relationship. Remember, you're moving from working for somebody to working with somebody. There's a form that we have to have not only filled out, but it has to be signed by our client, the person that we have that relationship with. It's the consent to transition from single agent to transaction brokerage. Out of all the forms that we deal with, that is the only form that must be signed. The transitional form from single agent to transaction brokerage. Now, in a non-residential transaction, we have something known as a designated sales associate. In a non-residential transaction, where you have a commercial transaction, if you will, where both the buyer and the seller have assets of at least $1 million plus each, the real estate broker can allow one of the agents to represent the buyer, one of the agents to represent the seller, in more of a fiduciary capacity. In other words, there's a lot of confidential information that doesn't need to be disclosed, and so they're working more in a fiduciary relationship. But again, there's a disclosure form for that as well. Regarding terminating agency relationships, there are a number of ways to do it. I like performance personally. That's when we do our job. But I think that it's important for you to note that, that bankruptcy is one of those things that if your seller decides to file bankruptcy, and once it's turned over to the bankruptcy trustee in the courts, your listing contract has been terminated. As far as Chapter 8's agency relationship, that's about all we have in there. And so what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to run through a quick review of what we just went over. Dual agency was repealed. Single agency has your full fiduciaries. You can work with either the buyer or the seller, but you cannot work with both in the same transaction. The disclosure form that we have for single agent relationships is either prior to showing property or prior to contract, whichever comes first. The transaction brokerage relationship has a limited obligation. You can work with both the buyer and the seller, but remember that you can't tilt. You can't work with one more than the other. You can't be favoritism. There are no disclosure forms required for the transaction brokerage relationship. By the way, Florida law presumes that we are transaction brokers unless we enter into another agreement with one of the other agency relationships. The no brokerage relationship, you have skill, care, and diligence. It's the minimum obligations, but we still have to disclose prior to showing property. Anytime that we transition to a transaction brokerage relationship, there has to be a transitional form signed by our client. And that's the end of that review.